This conference will now be recorded.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Making a Difference in Mental Health. I'm your host, Danielle Young.
And I'm your co-host, Wendy Grier.
We have a very special guest with us today, Miss Janet Norris, who is in the Greenbelt office, the Greenbelt, Maryland office, who is a fellow therapist and also a fellow community schools therapist. Hey, Janet, it's good to have you here.
Welcome,
Hey,
Janet.
Wendy.
So nice to have you with us today.
Danielle. Good.
So
Glad to be here.
Good. We're doing a two-part series on trauma, and as you know, there's been just so many traumatic events that have happened over the last few months, last 2 years in our country. And so our first guest that we had to speak about trauma was Kyle. He's the prescriber here at the Greenbelt office, and he was speaking from the perspective of psychiatry. And there's like a couple things that I just wanted to highlight again about trauma. People forget that trauma has three parts to it. It's the event that occurs, then it's the experience that happens, and then the effect. And I think that we as clinicians focus on the effect, like how do we get somebody moving through the trauma, their mental wounds, their physical wounds, all those things. And so we thought it would be great to hear from a frontline therapist as yourself here at the Greenbelt office to, shed some light on your perspective when you're dealing with it, especially in the school system, how it impacts you personally as well. And so, Janet, tell us a little bit about your mental health journey. How did you get involved in this field?
Oh, wow. Well, let's see. I think it started back when I was a case manager. So I was a case manager in DC and for a homeless shelter that catered to women who had mental illness and substance abuse. So co-occurring, but they had severe mental illness. And, just in the situations that they came from, right? You have women who sometimes were, working all their life or, in situations in marriages or, find themselves now homeless, right? And going through substance issues due to a lot of this sort of social stuff that has happened to them, losing their apartments, losing a job and different things like that. So it kind of started there. And I really enjoyed working and helping people. So opportunity came up on another part of DC at Washington Hospital Center, MedStar Washington Hospital Center, where there was a position as a mental health technician. And so it was in their Department of Psychiatry. And what the technician would do was work on the psychiatric unit, right, which was way different than I had, experienced. Although I had worked with people in the homeless shelter, women who were having these mental health challenges, this was in the hospital. These were really severely mentally ill people. And so from the psychiatric unit, I would also work in the emergency room where these people would come in and we would sort of assess them, right, along with the therapist, right, the social worker, therapists, and the doctors in the emergency room. So that's kind of where it started. And, the impact that I was able to, help people through stuff that they were going through. And because it was in the heart of DC, I knew some of these people who were coming in, right? And so that's sort of been my journey. And listen, I'm a product of DC. I lived in a very notorious part of the city in Southeast. And back when I was being raised in the 70s and 80s, you had a lot of epidemics going on. The PCP, there was a lot of crime and gangs and things like that. And so while all of this stuff was happening around me, I lived in it, right, in the middle of it. It wasn't happening in my household, but all of my, a lot of my friends that I grew up with, they were experiencing this. And I would witness a lot of this stuff. And so, just, seeing all of that, I really wanted to, get back with my community and help them through that because, I experienced it myself. There were times when, I experienced trauma when my father and mother separated, it was very traumatic for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
I went through my things as a youth, right? And I knew what that felt like. So, you know, that was how it started. And, I've been wanting to find a way that I can make an impact in people's lives, particularly those in those marginalized communities and, the ones of my own.
Right, right. Janet, you've talked about a number of things that sometimes when we're processing, and Wendy has already said it before, we look at a lot of ways to kind of solve the effect, but you kind of give us a journey to how you've even gotten to ABH, where you're talking about your experiences in the industries of, like, in the hospital setting, in the psychiatric setting. You're also talking about homelessness, and all of these things are like environmental traumas, family traumas, epidemics that you've experienced, even being a native of DC. And I know we've talked about that before, several, maybe last year sometimes, you kind of told me about some of your upbringing and some of the passion that you have when it comes to mental health and when it comes to assisting and helping those get back on the path of functionality by way of, housing, or by way of just mental health care. Can you tell us from that particular journey, how did you get to ABH?
Well, I enjoyed my work at the hospital, right? But it was very stressful. I was a mother at that time of two young men, right? And so I worked these hours that were crazy, 12-hour shifts, right? And so when I decided that I wanted to take it to another step and, do more, I love talking to people. Actually, if I go back a little bit, my bachelor's degree is in communication studies. So I, have a secondary in journalism. And so I love to do stories, right? I love reading and writing and things like that, right? And so that was that's part of who I am. So while I liked working in the on the psychiatric unit, I wanted the more one-on-one, right? Because I was used to when I was working with, I did some, newspaper work and things like that. So I would interview people, and I loved it, right? So I wanted to do more one-on-one stuff. So that was when I decided, I'm going to take this mental health field thing, to another level. And so that's when I decided to go to school and get my master's in social work. Um, yeah, and again, coming from the community that I wanted to, not only did I want to, work one-on-one with people, but I wanted to find a way that I could give back. And so one of my passions, and I think I've talked to Wendy and maybe you, Danielle, about it, is to, do workshops. Trauma is one of the things that I know. I don't know it in the sense of, professional training in the way that I want to know it, even though I'm going through training at this time. But it's something that I know personally, right? In the environment that I grew up in. So I wanted to do workshops and, things like that where we talk about things like ACEs, right? Doing
Yes.
workshops.
Can you tell us what ACEs is? I know you and I have had a conversation, but can you break that acronym down for our audience?
Yes. ACEs are advanced childhood experiences, right? And these are just like traumas, right? We think of trauma sometimes are as, like these big mass shootings, right? Those things are very traumatic, or, someone being killed in an accident and witnessing it. But ACEs are also things that are, that happens right in people's lives every day. Neglect, right? Physical and emotional and sexual abuse, right? All of the, those kinds of things, mental illness in your home, very personal, right? Those kind of things. So a lot of times when we see, for example, those who are incarcerated and those, who are going through substance issues, there's more to it than that, right? There's more to that. Trauma, it's layers. It's layers, right? And so I wanted to be able to find a platform that I could teach people and have them to understand that your circumstances doesn't just start right here, right?
Right.
It's part of what you've gone through in your life, some of those experiences that you've gone through. And so that's kind of, what I want to do.
I love that. You know that I'm always talking about connecting those dots. Like part of the work that we do, I feel is critical to have people understand why they act the way they do, and it is connected to something that they can really kind of touch and feel and understand, as opposed to just moving about the world and just being in confusion and being fearful and people labeling them as crazy and all of that. So I love that, Janet. And you and I are trained social workers, as is Danielle, so that is our perspective in our training, to look at the person and their environment and everything that affects them, and how do we make all of that better for a person. So that's wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about how you've taken this path, this journey, and now you've landed in a school system?
Yeah.
How's that been? How's that been for you?
And school just let out, so we kind of get a break. Janet, you get a break.
Exactly.
Right, we've been in COVID and everything. Like, how's it been for you?
Wow. It's a lot of these sort of distressing experiences that go on in the school with these students, unfortunately, right? I mean, a lot of them. We see, and it's sort of commonplace, in the way that it happens around there. It's like, okay, yeah, this is what I go through, and okay, you just kind of move on to the next thing. On my caseload, there are, many kids who have, even this past summer experienced, a father being shot down in a gas station that they go to it almost every day. So for that student to, have to go past that all the time, it's just, being re-traumatized. Having a student who, I have an 8-year-old who was sexually assaulted by, a person who was supposed to be babysitting them, a trusted person. Now here's a mother who's out there working hard, right? And, this is happening to her child. And then the husband dies of COVID, right? So all of these kinds of things, having another child who experiences domestic violence, and seeing his mom getting beat up. And now they have to move out of their home that they've brought up and used to, into a homeless shelter, right? So I see all of these kinds, and I would even go so to say, even the ones who are not experiencing it to that level, but kids who have lost parents over the years and they're living with other family members, right? And not being taken care of well, a form of neglect in a way. The parent, the father not showing up and taking care of the kid because grandma has him now. And so I see that a lot in school, and what we often find is, here is the event, right? Here's the event that has happened, but then the effects are, poor performance in school, right? The poor performance that you see in school.
Can we pause?
Yes.
1 second, I'm sorry.
This conference will now be recorded.
So Janet, you were saying that, we're getting on the topic of the effects, and since you're in the school system and you're housed every day at school, you're seeing all these kids who are experiencing these very personal daily traumas. You were telling us a little bit about, you're starting to tell us what you see. What are the effects that you're seeing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. We see a lot of, symptomatic children, who are, having a lot of anxiety attacks, right? Health anxiety in particular. We see a lot of that. I have a lot of communication with our nurse because children are in there all the time. I have a headache, or my stomach aches, just things like that. And so, seeing those who have emotion dysregulation, right? A lot of oppositional defiance in school, right? And, anger and aggression, lots of kids sleeping in school, right? And so a lot of what they're experiencing, these experiences are showing up, and they're having very poor performance in school, right? And so, it's almost like, with the ACEs study, in that we know these particular adversities and what they look like over the lifespan, right? They
Mhm.
cause it or put us at risk of a lot of health issues, right? And I would go so far to say that even put us at risk for, social well-being, a risk of
Mhm.
having, a good social well-being. And we're talking about these marginalized communities who may have unemployment, right, or underemployment because of the situations in school and the poor performance. Then later on in life, not only are they having these health issues because of these adversities, but they're
Mhm.
having the social part as well,
Yeah,
not being
absolutely.
able to develop healthy relationships, right?
But you
Being
just see that with the pandemic. Like, just
Mhm.
think about that for a second. Kids who spent a year and a half distance learning and then having to come back to school, and everything they learned about socialization went out the window because you're
Mhm.
seeing all,
Yep.
the kids fighting and oppositional behaviors. And, it's starting now. I think if we don't try to get a handle on it.
Mhm.
So that's a little frightening
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
and
concerning.
and 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 I'm talking about situations where we're talking about kids who have had these, traumatic experiences, and we know that children who haven't, even when they're away for the summer, they come
Mhm.
back and they're all, discombobulated because they forget about everything they learned. And when you add the traumas to it, when you add COVID to it, right?
Yeah.
When
Right.
you add these mass shootings, right? And all of that
Yes.
stuff, it's a lot. It's a lot. And that's
Yeah.
why I say when we think about trauma, it's layers. It's layers of that stuff, right?
Mhm.
So we have to
Mhm.
be very gentle,
And it
Yeah.
makes it complex.
Mhm.
very
Yeah.
You
complex.
know,
Yeah.
Yeah, very
people
complex.
layers, and they're interacting with each layer, and they're creating all this these experiences for people, negative experience for people. So it's just complex in terms of our work and trying to address the effects
Mhm.
of the trauma.
And Janet, I think this is something that we've said almost every single episode this season. We would like to see in 10 years with this particular cohort or this particular demographic of children and adults too, what it looks like in 10 years because of the COVID effect, because of the COVID response, because of even some of the social injustices. Like you said, you talk about the mass shootings, the school shootings, the
Racism.
racism, all of these things that have actually happened in about the last 2 years, maybe 4 years, depending on if you go back to the administration prior to this one.
Oh boy, that
But
was
when we
4 years
look
up. That's okay.
at
Go ahead.
when we look at the impact and the effect of what has happened to us in this country, that goes beyond just the regular everyday, but it gets deeper into the psychology of it and the
Mhm,
sociology of it. And you
mhm.
even spoke about like psychosomatic reactions. Sometimes we even see some of our students that we work with, Janet, who would otherwise never come to us, are experiencing, like you said, the headaches, or they don't quite know why, or there's the challenges with
Real. It's
socialization,
real.
and
It's very real.
missing a
Very
year
real.
or two of socialization when you're in from kindergarten, now you're in second grade, but you don't know the basics of inside voices, outside voices, how to share, when to give, and when
And to
to
listen, how
listen,
to
right?
behave in
Yeah,
general.
Right. And I
yeah.
think, as we talk about trauma, again, just about every single episode we've had this series, there is some type of streamline to it to
Hmm.
see what what is going to happen in the next few years. And I pretty much know that the mental health industry, we're pretty much here to stay,
We're not
because
Absolutely.
of
going
this.
anywhere.
But new studies, new techniques,
Research.
new research will probably develop because of the time that we're in. So,
Absolutely.
Janet, as
I,
we continue on, let's talk about maybe even some of the modalities that you use, or what is it that you're most proud of when it comes to being at ABH and being a clinician, being a social worker, being a therapist. What are you most proud of that you bring to the people that you work with?
mhm. If I can go back to say though, and thinking about how are we going to deal with all of this stuff
Mm-hmm.
that
Hmm.
we're experiencing in terms of COVID and all of the traumas and the stuff that we experience, I think that we have to, take a step back and, like you said, it's about psychology. We got to fix this. We got to fix this. We got to fix this, right? And I think that having community schools is one step, because we know that with children, it's just not academics, it's the whole child, right? And their family. So I think community schools was a great start, because we get to look at some of those things that happen behind the scenes outside of schools. And we make those connections, we make those dots, and we understand it, right? But we also have to be careful that we don't box, these students and these families in something. We have to shift our minds and not say, what's wrong with you, but, how did this happen to you, right? And then and kind of go from there. But I think for me, the thing that I'm most proud of is working in the community schools. I love it. It is the best thing, for me. It gives me an opportunity, to do therapy in real time, like real time.
Yes.
Right? When we work in a clinic, and as I do work in the clinic as well, as an offsite therapist, you get to schedule it. A lot of times our clients will have experienced what they have, or, want to come back and talk about it, whereby in community schools, we are here and it's in real time. So you get to use your skills. One of the things that works best for me, and it's not any formal training, but play therapy. I mean, we know that that's the environment that children thrive in. And so a lot of play therapy is what I use. Look into other resources like, visual aids. We do watch a lot of videos. And I kind of just, meet them where they are, right? So that's what I'm most proud of. It's a good feeling when you have, children coming to you in the morning and they're bringing you flowers as they walk in the door, right? Here, Miss Lewis, here's a flower. Or they come and there's a card that they've made up, right? Or, I go through the lunchroom, and let's say if I'm observing a student, I have a whole gang of kids that come and, hey, can we come in your room and sit with you? These are the things that make me feel good as a clinician. And so I really love it.
You and Danielle have elementary and middle schools, and I am a firm believer that, I did child welfare for 30 years, and I'm a firm believer that those are the age groups that you can make a change. If you get to them early enough, you can make a change. So that's my, tip for hope. Like, this is not a lost cause. I think I agree with you, Janet, having the community schools program and recognizing that we get to these kids early enough that we can change the score of an ACE test and break the cycle that, this is just another kid that's going to end up like their parent, and then that parent, and so forth and so on. So I'm very excited to be able to supervise you guys. And
if I can just say, Wendy, real quick, I think that that whole ACEs, tool, I think it would be great in our schools if we could find a way to bring it into the school. But I know it's kind of iffy because there's a lot there, right?
Yeah.
And it can bring up a lot of issues because we are mandated reporters and things like that. But some form of that, if we could bring that into school, because then that way we really know what we're dealing with, right? And then we can be more helpful to kids. But I also want to keep that, notion of being hopeful. We as a people, and particularly some marginalized communities, are very resilient, right? We're very resilient people. And so keeping hopeful and understanding that trauma looks different for different people, right? It's not a one size fit all, right? And so, just keeping that in mind and meeting people where they're at. I love this work.
And Janet, really quickly, for clinicians who are listening, therapists, counselors, mentors, interns even who are listening, would you happen to at least know a resource or maybe a website where we could find and kind of read up on ACEs? Can you provide that to us before we move on to the ending of our interview?
I don't have one right off at the top of my head, but I would say just Google ACEs. There's a big study from, the original study with the CDC and Kaiser Permanente that happened in I think somewhere in 1997 or in the 90s. And it talks about it. It has the tool, the questionnaire that's attached to that information, which is great.
Mhm.
I would recommend anybody to and everybody to take it, because you'll be surprised of how many of us that are holding a lot of these adversities that's there, right? And I think it's important because a lot of times in our work, and this is from some of what we do with folks is not always about them. Sometimes it's our own stuff, right? It's our own stuff, that whole counter transference stuff, right? When we see a broken person, we want to fix them so much, right? This trauma that they went through, not realizing that sometimes it's our stuff too. So this questionnaire would be a good thing to even look at yourself and say, okay, am I sometimes doing these things? Am I, approaching this the right way? And always, if there's trauma training in trauma informed care or TFCBT, if you can get that training, that'll be great as well.
And since you're talking about trauma, I really enjoyed the TFCBT training and, reading up on certain studies and new tools that are out there. But Janet, since we're talking about trauma, before we go, can you let our audience know what's a good way to manage trauma?
Well, I don't know that there's a one thing that I can say about managing trauma. What I can say, though, is that if you keep in mind that trauma has layers, right?
Mhm.
It goes beyond the event, right? It always does, right? For a kid who's in DSS for neglect or abuse, well, what's happening around that? Domestic violence in home, single motherhood, all of those things. So if you can understand that trauma is layers and there's something else, right? Then we don't focus so much on that, right? I know as mandated reporters and clinicians, we have to stabilize and make sure that they're safe and all those things. But keeping in mind, as I said, trauma looks different for everybody, right?
Right.
So just keeping those things in mind.
Yeah.
I don't know that there's any one way to manage it. You get your training, particularly if you're going to continue to work in this field, right? But, it's different, right? For everybody.
Right. I think that's a powerful message that it's different for everyone. And that, although we've been talking a lot about ACEs and tools and things like that, I don't want everyone to get caught up in that's data for us
Exactly.
to hone our skills, to come up with more creative ways to help people, manage the trauma. And I just want the audience to know that.
And if I could, oh, I'm sorry, Wendy, go ahead.
No, I was just saying, I just wanted the audience to know that's important, and that leads you to the path of reaching out and getting support and help. And we've talked lots about, self-care and all that. And, you can do it on the surface and you can go deeper with it as well, self-care. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah. One last word, Janet, before we close out.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, I think, understanding that it's layers, making sure that we get back to that whole, client-centered, particularly when you're talking about folks who have trauma, looking at their strengths and really looking at their strengths, right? And using those things to help them through this, right? Yes. Listening a lot more, which is a lot of what I'm working so hard on, right? We all, think that we're right, practice. We think that we are very empathetic listeners, and we are, right? But sometimes we need to really listen and not talk so much, And I just think, I love community schools. I'm so glad to be a community schools therapist, and I wish that they had, it in every school because it's so needed. And I think, working on this subject is really important because all of us are going through so much in this world right now.
Absolutely.
We need healing.
So there you have it. Active listening, understanding that everyone's experience is different, that it's layered. But if we have an empathetic ear, if we practice on listening more And, you know, with the goal to provide and to help those to get back to the path of functionality. And everybody's journey is different, and everybody's timing is different. But at the end of the
Absolutely.
day, that is us as clinicians, that is our goal for those that we serve. So
Absolutely.
what are your thoughts before we go, Wendy?
I love this conversation, Janet. I love having
Me
you
too.
with us to round out our part 2 series on trauma. And I am hopeful. Excuse me.
Bless you. I'm hopeful too.
I don't know what's happening today. Well, I'm going to cut it out. So say one more time about
What I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay.
and
So I love having
come
you.
in some.
Okay.
Okay.
So Janet, thank you so much for joining Danielle and me today on the podcast. We loved having you on to round out our part 2 series on trauma. You gave us a lot of good knowledge and information that I hope everybody who's listening in our audience, whether it's a clinician, a mentor, or just a client, or just anybody, got some tips from you about trauma. And I think it's encouraging that we're going to do that work, and we're going to get our clients through it, and that we're never stopping. We're just going to keep at trauma. But the most important thing is having these conversations about it and not making it this big mysterious issue. Everybody has trauma, and yes, it looks differently for everybody. So thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, we are so thankful again. Like we said, Janet, thank you for coming. My name is Danielle Young. This is my co-host,
Wendy Grier.
This is Making a Difference in Mental Health, where we're always striving to make a difference in mental health. We'll see you next time.
Stay safe.
Bye-bye.